Up until the 20th century, not many people really put a lot of stock in theories of guerrilla warfare. Up until this point, it was believed that an insurgent group would simply attack anything that they thought that they could get away with without the need for any more complicated theory. In the 20th century, however, one major thing started to change this, and that was how prominent ideology was being. And there are three major theorists who wrote about how guerrilla warfare is to be conducted. And they were Mao Zedong, Ernesto Guevara, and James Connolly. And if you know anything about these three individuals, you might notice they're all communists. Now, the reason for this is because the communists, being as they are a revolutionary ideology, guerrilla warfare is quite close to them and their ways of thinking. So these three people, on these entirely different occasions, created theories as to how guerrilla warfare should be conducted. By far and away the most popular of these nowadays is Mao. He wrote 4 separate books on the subject: on guerrilla warfare, on protracted war, problems of strategy in guerrilla warfare against Japan, and basic tactics. 4 different books focused on how guerrilla warfare is to be conducted. Now, Mao's theory has a couple of different tenets that are quite important, but the most important of these is the idea of protracted warfare. Quite famously, Chinese military thought has not been in favour of this. Sun Tzu, in The Art of War, wrote that no nation has ever benefited from a protracted war. Mao dissents from this, however, and he actually pulls up 3 different steps for how a protracted war is to go on. To Mao, the most important thing was to spend the enemy's resources and the enemy's lives. In a normal conflict, armies would attempt to gain territory, but for guerrillas, according to Mao, territory meant less than nothing. What he said was, to gain territory should not be a cause for joy, and to lose territory was not cause for despair. Because even if you held territory, you would have to spend manpower, and you would have to sacrifice your mobility to defend it. So guerrillas do not defend territory. Instead, according to Mao, guerrilla warfare consists around picking and choosing engagements in which you can damage the enemy, killing their people, taking their supplies, while not losing that of your own. In Basic Tactics, Mao writes, "If we do not have a 100% guarantee of victory, we should not fight a battle, for it is not worthwhile to kill 1,000 of the enemy and lose 800 killed ourselves." Mao and other communist theorists of guerrilla warfare insist quite heavily also on ideology being extremely important. To non-ideological guerrillas, they would spend most of their time training. To communist guerrillas, they would spend most of their time indoctrinating themselves in communist propaganda. Mao argues in favour of guerrilla bands being led both by a military officer and a political officer, and that those who are not ideologically aligned with the guerrilla movement are to be purged. Other communist theorists, such as Ernesto Che Guevara, and interesting thing about Che is an Argentinian piece of slang meaning dude, and this was because Che Guevara spoke kind of the way I do, in that he would say dude a lot, and so that became his nickname. His real name was Ernesto Guevara, but I'm going to call him Che, because that's what everyone else called him. Che came up with his theories entirely independent of Mao. However, they came to agree on a lot of issues. But there was one thing that Che disagreed with Mao. Mao believed that a successful guerrilla insurgency could not take place until the proper circumstances were in place for such a thing to occur. Che Guevara disagreed with this, and he said in his book, Guerrilla Warfare, that if such circumstances did not exist for a guerrilla revolution to take place, that a FOCO could create that, and FOCO is kind of his thing. He creates this concept of the FOCO being a small band of 30 to 50 men who would create the circumstances for a guerrilla revolution to begin. Example being that if a country is democratic and supports public discourse and freedom of movement, the FOCO would commit acts of terrorism to induce the regime to get rid of this and to become more and more authoritarian. However, Che falls into a very traditional communist trap of arrogance. You see, communist sort of worldview dictates that communism is just the best thing ever, and that capitalism is inherently fragile, unsustainable, and shit. and that it abuses the workers by trying to bring out the worst in everyone. Therefore, he sees no reason that people would not support him. This would very much come to bite him in the arse though, because after he left Cuba to start up communist revolutions across the world, a lot of people in these countries that he was trying to start up guerrilla wars in would arm themselves, and instead of joining him, they would go to kill him because he was inducing their government to become more draconian. And the CIA eventually ended up finding these groups and funding them. And in 1967, Bolivian anti-communist partisans captured him and summarily executed him. These guys, though, they very much focused on the countryside. James Connolly, the third theorist, disagreed with this approach entirely. James Connolly argued in a couple of his newspaper articles, because James Connolly didn't actually write books, he only wrote newspaper articles and propaganda pamphlets. He argued in these that guerrilla warfare could and should be conducted in urban areas. The reason being that guerrilla warfare tends to be more effective in areas with choke points such as mountains, and he described the streets of cities as being just a fuck ton of choke points. However, he kind of forgot that in cities there's also a fuck ton of civilians who he had to get on his side in order to do anything. And communism isn't necessarily as appealing to a lot of people as they always think it was. James Connolly is most well known for his contribution to the Easter Rising in 1916, in which he put his theories into practice of urban guerrilla warfare. However, this resulted in him being shot, injured quite badly, and then captured. All in all, Mao ends up being by far and away the most popular of these theorists because he was the most successful. There is a thing to be said about the volume that they wrote. Mao wrote 4+ books, Che Guevara wrote 1, and Connolly wrote none, so that makes Mao's writing a lot more accessible. But I think by far and away the most important factor into why he became so much more important is Mao ended his guerrilla career as a semi-successful head of state. Che Guevara ended his guerrilla career on the floor in Bolivia riddled with bullets, and James Connolly ended his guerrilla war tied to a chair before a British firing squad, too badly injured to stand for his own execution.